90 minutes before the bombs were supposed to fall, the most powerful long-range aircraft on Earth were already in the air. And then a phone call changed everything. American strategic bombers, loaded and mission-ready, had their targets locked. Iranian power plants, bridges, civilian infrastructure. The orders existed, the pilots had them. And then, without warning, those aircraft banked hard, reversed course, and returned home. No strikes, no explosions, no civilization consumed by fire. So what actually happened in those final 90 minutes? And what does it mean for the next 2 weeks, for global oil prices, and for a world that came terrifyingly close to crossing a line it could never uncross? Welcome to Global Conflict Feed. I'm David. This channel exists to cut through the noise on the world's most consequential events. Raw analysis, no spin, no filler. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the moment. What I'm about to walk you through is one of the most significant 48 hours in modern geopolitical memory. Let's build the full picture, because context here is everything. This conflict, and we should call it what it is, a war, began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran under an operation targeting military sites, nuclear infrastructure, and Iranian leadership. That was not a skirmish. That was a war's opening move, and Iran's counterstrike was immediate, dramatic, and globally devastating. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. If the weight of that sentence hasn't landed yet, let me put real numbers in front of you. The strait is 21 miles across at its narrowest point. Through that bottleneck flows roughly 20 million barrels of oil every single day, approximately 20% of all seaborne oil traded globally. Every barrel the Gulf produces passes through that corridor on its way to the world, and Iran slammed the door shut. The International Energy Agency officially designated this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That is not commentary. That is the institution whose entire purpose is monitoring global energy flows, stating, on the record, that this is unprecedented. Bigger than the 1973 Yom Kippur embargo, bigger than the 1979 Iranian Revolution, bigger than anything the modern energy system has absorbed. Brent crude surged past $100 a barrel for the first time in 4 years. It peaked at 126. Bloomberg analysts were running scenarios showing prices reaching $200 a barrel if the closure extended through the second quarter. The Dallas Federal Reserve published modeling projecting that a single quarter of Hormuz closure would strip nearly 3 percentage points from annualized global GDP growth. Does that number sound abstract to you? It shouldn't. 3 percentage points is the difference between a sluggish recovery and a global recession. The United Nations Trade Agency warned of cascading effects on food prices, fertilizer supply chains, and aviation costs. Gulf nations, including Kuwait and Qatar, faced what economists labeled a grocery supply emergency, with 70% of their food imports disrupted by mid-March. The Philippines implemented a temporary 4-day working week to manage fuel costs. Airlines rerouted around the region entirely. Major shipping lines, including Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, suspended Middle East operations. This was not just an oil crisis. It was an everything crisis. The strait carries roughly 1/3 of global seaborne methanol trade, nearly half of all sulfur exports, significant aluminum volumes, and the petroleum coke that feeds electric vehicle battery manufacturing. The Strait of Hormuz isn't a geographic curiosity. It's the single most consequential choke point in the global economy. Now, what actually happened in the 48 hours before the ceasefire? Because this was not a clean diplomatic resolution. It was chaotic, last minute, and full of contradictions still playing out as I record this. In the days before the deadline, President Trump had been issuing escalating warnings on Truth Social. On Easter Sunday, April 5th, he posted a message describing a planned strike on power plants and bridges, telling Iranian leadership bluntly to open the strait or face consequences. That is a sitting president of the United States on social media. The threat was real. The deadline was real. But inside the White House, there was a split. On one side, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Senator Lindsey Graham. all pushing Trump to reject any deal without major Iranian concessions up front. On the other, Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, all advising that a reachable deal was worth taking. And then Pakistan entered the room. This detail keeps getting buried in coverage, and it should not be. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir personally reached out to President Trump. They proposed a framework, a 2-week ceasefire during which Iran would reopen the strait and both sides would enter formal negotiations. Trump confirmed in his announcement that he agreed to suspend strikes based directly on that conversation with Prime Minister Sharif and Field Marshal Munir. Pakistan is not an obvious mediator in a US-Iran conflict, but they had both the motivation and the access. Pakistan relies heavily on Gulf energy imports. Their economy had been battered by the Hormuz closure. And critically, they had credibility with both parties. This is what geopolitical improvisation actually looks like: messy, human, real. And in this case, it worked. Now let's get into what was actually agreed, because this is where it gets genuinely complicated. On the American side, Trump announced a 2-week suspension of strikes. He described it publicly as a mutual ceasefire. He acknowledged receiving a 10-point proposal from Iran and called it, in his words, a workable basis for negotiation, careful not to say he accepted it, only that it could serve as a starting point. On the Iranian side, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed the agreement through Iran's Supreme National Security Council. If attacks on Iran ceased, Iranian armed forces would stand down their defensive operations. Safe passage through the strait would be permitted, but with a critical caveat. Passage would require coordination with Iranian armed forces and consideration of what he called technical limitations. Those limitations are sea mines. Iran had mined sections of the strait during the conflict. They cannot be located and removed quickly. So Iran is saying, ships may pass, but only through lanes we designate. Before the war, over 100 ships transited the strait daily. In the entire preceding month of conflict, barely 100 ships total passed through. That is the scale of the bottleneck forming even under a functional ceasefire. And then the ceasefire immediately began fracturing. Within minutes of the announcement, missiles launched from Iran toward Israel. One was intercepted near Tel Aviv. Iranian naval forces reportedly halted tanker traffic through the strait again hours after the first vessels passed, citing Israel's continued operations in Lebanon. Gulf states reported new Iranian attacks on oil infrastructure. Iran's parliament speaker publicly accused the United States of violating 3 specific points of the agreement. Here is what that fracturing actually tells us. And this matters enormously. The disconnect between what Iran's political leadership agreed to and what its military forces were doing is not necessarily top-level bad faith. It reflects something structurally significant. The wave of targeted assassinations throughout this conflict, hitting Iranian commanders, IRGC leadership, naval officers, has severely degraded Iran's chain of command. Lower-level units with access to launch systems aren't always processing orders from Tehran with speed or clarity. We saw this pattern during what analysts called the 12-day war last year. Ceasefires get announced. Compartmentalized units keep firing. It doesn't automatically mean the deal is dead. It means implementation will be contested. Vice President Vance characterized the situation directly: a fragile truce. He stated plainly that if the strait did not meaningfully reopen, the president would not abide by the terms. That is a specific ultimatum tied to a specific, measurable deliverable. Then there is the Lebanon problem, the most politically explosive element in this entire puzzle. Israel has been conducting sustained operations in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif publicly stated the ceasefire covered Lebanon. Iranian negotiators appear to have understood Lebanon as included. The White House stated clearly, Lebanon is not part of this agreement. Netanyahu confirmed his government would comply with the ceasefire regarding Iran but continue operations in Lebanon. So, the mediator says one thing, one party believes another, the other party's position is a third. European leaders from Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and Canada issued a joint statement calling on all sides to implement the ceasefire, including in Lebanon. The EU's Ursula von der Leyen called it a potential pathway out of what she warned could become a severe global energy crisis. But that statement carries no enforcement mechanism. It is a plea, not a guarantee. Now, Iran's 10-point proposal. This document is the key to understanding where the next 2 weeks go. Point 1. Iran wants a guarantee it will not be attacked again. Point 2. A permanent end to the war. Not a pause, a permanent end. Point 3. An end to Israeli strikes in Lebanon. Point 4. Lifting of all U.S. sanctions. Point 5. An end to all regional combat against Iranian allied forces. In return, Point 6. Iran reopens the strait. Point 7. A Hormuz transit fee of $2 million per vessel. Point 8. Oman shares in those fees. Point 9. Iran provides safe passage rules. Point 10. Fees fund reconstruction, not reparations. Point 7 will generate the most friction at the table. $2 million per ship might sound modest against the value of a very large crude carrier, but the precedent it creates is extraordinary. If Iran can charge a toll to pass through an internationally recognized strait, what stops Denmark from charging through the Danish straits? What stops Spain from levying fees at Gibraltar? This would reverse 2 centuries of maritime freedom of navigation norms. Iran knows they are unlikely to win this point. Its strategic value is as a bargaining chip, something to sacrifice in exchange for the concessions they actually want. The White House's stated position: they have accepted none of the 10 points. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt described the original proposal as literally discarded by the president's negotiating team. So there is already a foundational dispute between what Iran says was agreed and what Washington acknowledges. This mirrors every major ceasefire in modern history. Both sides frame the moment as their victory. Both narratives serve a domestic political purpose. Neither is fully accurate. Talks are expected in Islamabad beginning Friday, April 10th. Vice President Vance is expected to lead the American delegation. Iran's side will reportedly include Foreign Minister Arakchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Pakistan hosts. And the 2 most contested issues at the table are also the 2 where the gap between the parties is widest. First, Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Trump hardened his position late Wednesday. No uranium enrichment, period. Iran's proposal reportedly includes enrichment as a baseline requirement. King's College London analyst Andreas Krieg noted that the enrichment question is precisely what collapsed the previous round of negotiations in February. Iran treats enrichment as a sovereign right. The United States treats continued enrichment as an existential proliferation risk. There is no obvious middle ground. Second, sanctions. Iran wants all sanctions lifted immediately. That is a non-starter in the current political environment without extraordinary verified concessions. The Trump administration has signaled it might discuss targeted relief, but within a framework of verifiable Iranian compliance on nuclear and military limits. Iran will want those limits minimized. The United States will want them maximized and verified. This negotiation could take months, not days. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas modeling is stark on what this means economically. A single quarter of Hormuz closure could lower global GDP growth by nearly 3 percentage points annualized. Oil had already surged to $126 a barrel at peak. The ceasefire announcement sent crude below 100 almost immediately. Global equity markets surged. S&P futures indicated a 2% plus jump at open. The market was pricing in relief, but that relief rests on a ceasefire already showing cracks. The journalist release deserves more attention than it has received. American journalist Shelley Kittleson had been kidnapped in Baghdad a week earlier by an Iran-backed Iraqi Shia militia. She was released before the ceasefire announcement. According to the State Department, her release resulted from intensive behind-the-scenes work by the Iraqi government, operating entirely separately from the main U.S.-Iran negotiations. That matters because it tells us something real about Iraq's capacity and motivation to act as an independent diplomatic player, not just a proxy battlefield. Here is the structural reality underneath all of this. This is not a peace deal. This is a pause. A critically important pause, one that prevented what could have been an irreversible military escalation, one that gives the global economy a window to breathe, one that gives diplomats a table. But it is a pause, not a resolution. The enrichment question, the sanctions question, the regional proxy forces question, the maritime sovereignty question embedded in Point 7, none of these have been resolved. None will be resolved in 2 weeks. 3 things to watch in the coming days. Watch the strait. Not just whether ships are moving, but under what terms and whose coordination. If Iran requires its armed forces to clear every transit, that is not freedom of navigation. It is Iranian sovereignty over international waters. Watch Lebanon. If Israeli operations there continue at current intensity, Iran's military factions will use that as justification to resume attacks, possibly regardless of what Tehran's political leadership has agreed. That variable could unravel this deal faster than anything else. And watch Islamabad. The talks beginning Friday are the first real test of whether a genuine negotiating path exists. Fragile things break. That is not a metaphor. That is Vice President Vance's exact characterization of where things stand. The next 2 weeks will tell us whether the world's most consequential military conflict of 2026 has found a genuine exit, or whether Tuesday night was simply the pause before the next escalation. Global Conflict Feed will be covering every development, every negotiating shift, every market signal, every escalation, in real time. If this kind of analysis matters to you, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. And subscribe to Global Conflict Feed so you never miss what comes next. David out.